talk a little bit about smart homes, probably 2 years ago at this point in time. And I had done a little bit of dabbling in smart home technology with my own house and realized how confusing everything was. So we decided just to kind of put together a quick presentation on it. I know it's a little bit off topic for what we usually talk about in the inspection business, but we will end this class talking about how smart home technology is really starting to impact both my business as an inspector and your business as brokers. And the problem is only going to get more complicated here as time goes on because the technology is actually accelerating. So let's talk a little bit about it. And the official title is not Smart Homes, Dumb People. It's actually Smart Homes. But I know I feel like technology is eclipsing me. Maybe that's just a sign of my advancing age, but I also know I'm not the only one out there that feels that way. It seems like everything out there, device-wise, is smarter than me now. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about that. And let's start talking about, well, kind of defining the smart home a little bit. And understand that home automation is not new. We've had things like automatic and programmable thermostats for literally decades at this point in time. We've had motion sensors that turn lights on and off as you enter or leave a room for, even longer than that. We've had basically programmable appliances since I was a kid in the 1970s, things like coffee makers, crock pots, stuff of that nature. And we've had dumb timers, mechanical timers, forever, for decades and decades. So some form of home automation has actually existed out there for quite a while at this point in time. And actually, as I look around my own house, which is where a lot of these pictures are going to come from, I still have forms of that, what we would think of as ancient technology out there. We've got, lights in our night lights in our hallways to provide a little bit of lighting at night that are basically just photo cells. On my kids' bathroom, because, well, when they were younger, they couldn't reach a light switch very well. We still have photo cells in timers in those bathrooms as well. So even in, a house that was built in 2004 that I think has a relatively large amount of smart technology in it, we have still got some of this kind of old, dumb electromechanical technology actually in quite a few areas of the house. I put that switch in when my kids were little, which was more than a decade ago now. But these night lights, we just added when my in-laws started spending quite a few weekends with us to give them a little bit more illumination at night. So there is a lot of this technology that absolutely still exists and is still being sold today. When we talk about home automation needs, so when we start talking about what we think of as more smart technology, we're really looking at two things. We're looking at controlling operational things like lighting, heating, and cooling, stuff of that nature, or controlling communications distribution throughout our house, like audio, video, internet security. So that home automation, that smart technology kind of falls into one of those two categories when we begin to look at it, with the ultimate promise being that we could control everything with a button. Well, that was the first promise. Then we could control it with our computer. That was the next evolution of smart home technology. Eventually, we could control it with our phone, which is really just a computer we hold in our hand. And now the promise everybody makes as far as smart home technology is concerned is you can control it with your voice. You can literally talk to that technology and make things happen. So the idea of smart home technology has evolved quite a bit over the years, from being able to control things with buttons to now literally being able to talk to it and control it. And when we further look at smart home technology, there's actually two kind of basic methodologies for making it happen. There's two ways that automate many of these same things, but with very different approaches. There's what we call structured wiring, which is becoming less common, but is actually way simpler and way more reliable than our second technology, which is all these wireless systems that we're dealing with today. And this wireless technology is becoming kind of the predominant technology, but it's way more complicated than wired technology, and it's way less reliable than wired technology. So let's take a quick look at both of those. So when we talk about wired technology, technically we're talking about what's called structured wiring. And generally we mean probably half a dozen different wiring technologies. They're all low voltage, with some kind of central distribution panel. And then that wiring runs from that panel to some kind of wall outlet where we're going to plug in our smart device, whether that be a TV or whether that be a security camera, something like that. Typically, that structured wiring is installed as the house is being built. We put it in before we put in drywall. So what that means is you have to anticipate your needs and add cable for those needs, and then maybe a little extra for contingencies. The upshot here is that this is going to be, in the end, a much simpler system to maintain and to work with than a wireless system, but it's got some idiosyncrasies to it. Number one, it's got to kind of be installed when we're building the house. Number two is you're generally going to have some kind of panel box, which is a central location where those cables terminate, kind of like a breaker panel, and where we install a lot of our control equipment. And then in that panel box, you'll have various kinds of snap-in control elements that provide the freedom to connect things according to the preference for each room. It's where you're going to put your wireless router, or actually it's going to put where your wired and wireless router, which is usually the same thing these days. It's where you're going to put internet switches. It's where you're going to attach hubs, which we'll talk about later. And then you'll have wiring for internet access or full entertainment, security, household controls, those kind of things. And you guys have seen this technology in new construction since at least about the year 2000. And it's still being installed today because at least this portion of the smart home actually changes fairly slowly. So you'll hear a lot of people in both of our industries talk about on-cue panels because that's a prominent brand. But essentially what we're talking about is a panel box that looks something like this. And again, it's analogous to a circuit breaker panel. It's where all of our structured wiring, so our Cat 5 or 6 Ethernet cable, it's where our coaxial cable comes in for cable TV still in the house. It's where our phone lines, if we still have phone lines in a house, actually come into one central location. In a really nice installation, it looks like the picture on the left where everything is neatly wired and neatly routed to the various control modules in there. And you've got some distribution hubs or some splitters for coax. You've got actually a hub or a landing grid for Cat 5, a distribution panel for Cat 5 wiring there. This one actually has a router built into it on the left. This is what the ideal of it looks like. What they really look like in the real world is the picture on the right. Everything is kind of messy. It's not too bad. I've certainly seen worse than that panel, but stuff gets brought in, it gets added later. This one actually doesn't have a splitter for coax. Somebody's added that later on for a satellite TV system, and it ends up looking more like the one on the right-hand panel. But the idea is we've got one central location for all that structured wiring where we make the terminations for it, and then it branches out throughout the house. And there's some real pros that go to this system. Each cable has a direct connection to that panel box, which keeps your transmission integrity good. There's no real severe loss of signal like this. It's relatively easy to reconfigure for different applications, and it's relatively easy to upgrade at least the panel portions of it. You just unplug the cable from your old component and plug in your new one. It's easy to install when the house is being built with lots of different options available. And the really cool part of it is it can be used for really any level of home automation, regardless of how complex it is, because those wired standards are pretty solid, pretty set in stone. And basically anything you buy that works with wired standards is going to work with what's in your house. So all those standardized wires are compatible with new equipment. So there's a lot of real pros to a wired system. There's also some cons to it. It's hard to know what your house is going to look like in the future and what you'll need ahead of time. It's fairly expensive to install this because you are running real honest to goodness copper wire. It's tougher to do as a retrofit, especially say in a 2-story house because you've got to pull wire through the walls, and it can eventually become obsolete. In a cable TV system, that old RG6 coaxial cable is now being supplanted by HDMI cable for high resolution video and sound. Cat 5 Ethernet cable, an older standard, is being superseded by Category 6 or Category 7 Ethernet cable, which can carry more data on it. So eventually that wiring can get old and need to be replaced, but it does generally take a while for that to happen. The reason that happens is because the standards we're going to talk about in this presentation are constantly evolving, and they seem to be evolving at an ever more rapid pace. This is true of all smart home standards, both wired and wireless, but it's especially true of the wireless standards we're going to talk about. It's even happened with something as simple as basic Wi-Fi, which now actually has numbers instead of letters that it started out with. What we originally thought of as Wi-Fi way, way back in the day was what was officially called 802.11b, which was the part of the standard that applied to it. And then that standard kept evolving and evolving and evolving. It went from B to A to G to N to AC, and now we're going to talk about what's called Wi-Fi 6, which is now actually designated AX, which has only been released in 2019. The point here, don't get lost with all these numbers and letters, is that even something as basic to everyday life now as Wi-Fi, those standards have evolved over time. And that's part of what causes the problems with smart home devices. So this has happened in the smart home device space as well, especially with wireless devices like wall switches, light bulbs. Well, actually, pretty much anything now you can buy wireless, and it's generally going to use one of these current standards. It's going to use either what's called a Z-Wave or a Zigbee standard. It may connect to its own Wi-Fi network, but the biggest problem we have here is that there are still a lot of proprietary standards out there for smart home devices. Most of them actually use some slightly modified variation of Z-Wave or Zigbee, but it's still a proprietary standard that doesn't talk to anything else. So when you start looking at all these different standards that all these different smart home, the wireless ones use, things like Apple HomeKit is gaining more popularity, but it's still not terribly widespread. Lutron, which is the type of smart switch that I use in my house, basically has its own standard. Philips Hue light bulbs, a lot of people really like those, and I use a couple of those in my house, has its own standards. So it's the proprietary standards when we start talking about wireless stuff that can really lead to a lot of problems in smart home technology. So all of these wireless standards, all of these smart device standards are also evolving just like Wi-Fi is. A lot of these existing standards are actually supposed to be replaced with a new one that's called the Matter standard. It used to be called Connected Home over IP or chip, but I guess they decided that was a little too on the nose, and now they're calling it the Matter standard. And it's going to be supported theoretically by most smart device manufacturers out there, the Apples, Amazons, Googles of the world, and it's supposed to enable a more seamless integration. It's maintained by the same alliance that maintains the Zigbee alliance, so you can kind of think of it as an evolution of that. It is open source, which is nice. It means the source code's available to anybody who wants to manufacture these devices, and they don't have to pay a royalty on it. But even it, as a modern standard, has some problems. It was originally supposed to launch in late 2020. That's been delayed until later this year and is probably going to be delayed again. It's not a single technology, and it should evolve and improve over time, but it's not going to be able to cover every possible use case for every device and scenario. And some of our existing devices will work with it after we do a firmware upgrade on them, but a lot of them will not, which means if you're going to use it, you may have to replace a lot of existing equipment in your house. So again, don't get too lost in all the names and numbers and everything here. The idea is these standards are continually evolving over time. They are not all compatible with each other, and nothing is as seamless as all these manufacturers and their commercials would like to lead us to believe that it actually is. Because one of the things they don't tell you when they're doing all of their advertising is that when you start installing smart home devices in your house, you are going to need some kind of hub. And in fact, you are probably going to need more than one kind of hub, depending on what you install. If you're installing just Wi-Fi stuff, which actually isn't all that common, you can probably just do it with your existing wireless router. If you're going to start installing other smart devices, you may have to install a SmartThings hub from, say, Samsung. If you're installing Apple compatible devices, you'll need something that runs with HomeKit. you're going to probably end up needing multiple hubs in your house. And on top of that, you'll probably also end up needing multiple what are called bridges for any proprietary devices like those Lutron cassette switches or Philips Hue light bulbs that we just talked about. So you end up having to install an Apple TV for your Apple stuff. Or you end up with, and this is a picture actually that we'll probably refer to a couple times. This is what's attached to my OnQ box in my master bedroom closet, but this is my router and my hubs and everything else that I use to control the smart stuff in the internet in my house. So you end up with actually a fairly fancy router in this case, a fairly fancy switch for all that structured wiring I've got, and then two bridges sitting up here, one of which is the SmartThings hub, and the other one is a different technology that we're going to talk about a little bit later called Habitat. And then on top of all of that, I've got even more of that stuff in my basement. And some of this is because I run a business out of my house, so we need a little bit fancier setup. But some of it's just normal home automation stuff. So in my basement, I've got two more bridges. I've got the one on the left here is for that Lutron cassette system, and the one on the right is actually for those Philips Hue light bulbs. And I will tell you guys, I actually just moved that Philips bridge upstairs where it has better connectivity with that stupid SmartThings hub that you can see in this picture. So the takeaway here is that once you start adding a couple of different types of devices that use a couple of different standards or proprietary standards, it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. None of these systems or standards are fully compatible with the others, and no one system covers all the bases. There's not one good solution for all your smart light switches, all your smart light bulbs, maybe a smart thermostat that's thrown in there, maybe security cameras that are thrown in there. There is no one good universal brand or standard that covers all of that. So most smart homes end up with a mixture of these systems and standards, and they get really messy really quick. So when you look at a typical smart home these days, hell, this is kind of the way I tried to set up my house. And keep in mind, I am not an expert in this. I kind of only dabble in it because I enjoy it and my engineer's brain likes it. But when you look at a typical smart home, like what I've eventually come up with here, you try and use universal devices where possible. And what you find out pretty quick is those tend to be pricey because, well, you've got to pay to be able to work with all of those systems. So like in my house, I've got an Ecobee thermostat. I've actually got two of them to control my HVAC system. I've got a whole bunch of Lutron cassette switches and dimmers for smart lighting. For colored light bulbs, because my kids like to change lights according to the season, I actually have ended up using Philips Hue light bulbs, which you've ever priced them, get pretty expensive. And those are mostly universal. They work with a lot of the different standards out there. In some cases, you end up installing cheaper generic devices like generic Zigbee light bulbs and generic Zigbee smart plugs out there. I've ended up with an Apple TV as a hub for my HomeKit stuff, and then a SmartThings hub for everything else out there. It gets messy quick. So then the question becomes, can all this stuff be unified? And the answer to that is maybe eventually, but it's going to take years and a lot of device replacement to make that happen. There are people out there trying to do that. There's a company called Habitat that makes a hub that's been designed to be open source and modifiable over time, and it should be able to be evolved. So you'll be able to connect more stuff to it than you will be some of these other manufacturers like Samsung's and their SmartThings hub. It's designed to be one hub to rule them all. But stuff like that gets complicated and even requires some programming and scripting to make it work. So it's not a great solution out there for a lot of people who don't want to learn how to do that. There are other varieties of devices out there that work, but only with their own cloud control enabled. They don't work locally. They're not, their bridge is actually controlled by their cloud service that resides on their server somewhere off in the internet. All of this gets very complicated very quickly, and it just gets kind of ugly. And this even happens in my house. You look at individual switch boxes in my home, and like this one in my master bedroom has got Lutron cassette switches for lights, fans, and outlets. It had an old fan controller, which has now since been replaced with a cassette one since they finally came out with one. It's got a sensor for my thermostat that helps control temperature in the bedroom. It just gets very complicated very quickly. I've got other ones where light switches have been basically replaced with hue lighting controls, which, believe it or not, did not have a relatively good solution for local control up until very recently. But all of this stuff gets very complicated to integrate after a while. I've got two Ecobee thermostats, one on the first floor, one on the second floor. And then to make this entire network literally work, I've had to install basically smart plugs on outlets, not because we needed them there, but because they're network repeaters that pick up the signal for this Zigbee network and broadcast it all throughout the house. And then I've had to put in multiple Wi-Fi access points on top of all of that. So it gets very complicated very quickly, and it doesn't live up to the commercials and the promos that you see for smart home stuff all the time. Everybody is still competing in this space, trying to make their system the dominant one. And when you try and integrate everything into one single smart home, it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. And it still doesn't work great. So, does it actually all work? It mostly works, and it's gotten more stable over time, but it's still not 100% reliable. In my own house, I had one generic smart light bulb that we used outside that we could change colors with for Christmas and Halloween that wouldn't report its status back to the network, and it crashed the entire network. All of a sudden, nothing would work right, and it was that one stupid $12 light bulb. I actually used the wrong hue integration when I was setting this stuff up, and that made all of my hue light bulbs actually unreliable and caused parts of the network to crash. So I'm using my house as an example because it's what I'm familiar with, but this kind of stuff happens every day out there in this smart home technology. When you try and put all this together, it requires lots of setup and tweaking. It's complicated. It's far from plug and play, and it's still a very immature industry with lots of evolution and lots of subsequent growing pains happening even still today. And actually, what you eventually come back to, believe it or not, is that wired technologies still work way, way better than all this wireless stuff that's being pushed on us these days. People think about wired as kind of the past and who would actually want to run copper wire for something. I got to tell you, it works way better and way more reliably than all of the wireless stuff we have to deal with these days. When you start looking at all this smart home stuff, you realize that devices often work best with a static IP address. Do you guys know how to set that up? Most people have no idea how to set a static IP address through their router's firmware or through their router's interface to basically give that smart device one known location on your network. Lots of brands still require some form of cloud control or a remote server. I got to tell you, that is not always a very reliable technology because it means the commands for your smart devices actually have to travel out onto the internet for that cloud server to make the change and then send the command back to your smart device. They don't run with local control. That is not a terribly reliable technology. There are a few brands or systems that can be set up with either limited local control or cloud control. But to do all of this, that network often requires repeaters like those plugs we were just talking about, multiple access points for network stability. It's not an easy thing to set up and make reliable. And I would argue that anytime you're depending on wireless technology, which most people actually do now, most people don't want to do any wired technology in their smart house. They want to depend completely on that wireless technology. It's going to be less than 100% reliable when you do that. So that's kind of the state of the industry. How does all of this affect us in the world of real estate? Well, what happens to a house full of smart devices, or even just a couple of smart devices, when it gets sold? My house, when I stop to think about it, and I have what I would consider to be limited smart technology, has got probably, after all this time, literally thousands of dollars worth of smart devices that I've installed over time throughout the years. So that's quite an investment. If I go to sell this house, do those smart devices stay or do those smart devices go? There's often a substantial cost involved with this equipment. And I got to tell you, I would be very tempted to pull out all of those Lutron Cassetta switches and take them with me to my new house because those actually do work. It's a reliable technology and they are not cheap to install. So that's something to think about in the world of real estate. Does that equipment stay or does it go? Those smart devices are also almost always paired to a hub or a cloud service. And the important thing here is those hubs and cloud services are tied to an individual protected account. So if that equipment stays, it may be locked to the person that has just sold that house. How do you unlock it and get it tied to the new owners of that property? A lot of smart devices, hubs, etc., cannot be reset unless they're actually removed by that original account owner, by the person that originally set them up. So if it's not an amicable transaction, all of a sudden you could be stuck with a house full of smart devices that you literally can't do anything with. So I'm just curious how you guys these days are writing this into contracts. And if you're not, it's going to be something you're going to have to be doing soon as all of these devices proliferate and become more common. You can go online and see lots of stuff now in Reddit and Facebook and places like that of Google Nest thermometers where it's locked to an account where people can't do anything with it when they move into that house. And if you have to call a gigantic, humongous, not customer-centric company like Google and try and get that Nest thermometer reset, that's going to be a pretty significant investment in time and frustration to do that. You'll see other stuff where people are actually just taking those smart thermostats with them and leaving bare wires hanging out of the walls. So keep all of that in mind because that is actually how it pertains to real estate and smart home technology. On top of all of this, there are also quite a few security concerns involved with all of this smart technology we're putting into our houses these days. Most smart device control data and information travels across the internet in some way, shape, or form. And that data, God, just like everything else we do these days, is often stored, analyzed, and sold by the companies that manufacture those devices. That data is becoming a humongous commodity and source of revenue, which actually means that you and I and everybody else who uses this technology is actually becoming the commodity and the source of revenue. This is especially true if you use any kind of voice assistant. Remember, when you talk to Siri or Google or Alexa, that request has to be sent across the internet, translated at some server somewhere into a language the machine understands, and then sent back to that device to control that device. It is entirely dependent on that technology company. And some of those companies like Apple are better at privacy than others, like Google, which, or God forbid, Facebook, which are absolutely terrible at it. A lot of these ecosystems and almost all of the hubs and bridges we've talked about depend entirely on a cloud component to function properly. So that data is constantly traveling back and forth. There are some devices that can be controlled locally, but they are usually pretty simple. Oftentimes they're simple smart bulbs that you can turn on and off or change, but they require Bluetooth or something like that, unless you want that data to travel over the internet. And remember, like I just said, some brands like Apple, Ecobee, which is my thermostat, Habitat, which is kind of founded based on local control and privacy, take that privacy more seriously than other companies like Google and Samsung and Facebook, who literally just take all of that data and sell it to the highest bidder and use it to develop a pattern or kind of a template for our everyday lives. And just remember, I know you guys hear this all the time. It's just truer now than it ever has been. You are actually the product for a lot of this technology. I wanted to show you guys one other picture. Um, this is Farumba balsara. My youngest child has this weird habit of literally naming everything in our house. And this is a strange aside, but if you're a Queen fan, and my youngest child is a Queen fan, she's firmly rooted in the 70s for some reason. Freddie Mercury's real name was Farouk Balsara. So when we got our first robot vacuum cleaner, she named him Farumba Balsara and then stuck eyes on him and a bear and other stuff. The point here is that when we bought this vacuum cleaner, this Roomba, it's made by iRobot, they were originally a company that had their roots in military technology, which to me is fine, but they were fairly privacy focused. The problem here now is that Amazon just bought them and bought all the data that goes with them. So this robot, when he moves through my house, and I got to tell you, he does a really good job cleaning, has now developed an entire map of the first floor of my house. Actually, a very detailed map of the first floor of my house. What is Amazon going to do with that data? First of all, they're going to sell it because there's money there. And second of all, they're probably going to use it to look at how many bathrooms I've got, how big my kitchen is, and try and sell me stuff. It's just a great illustration of how all of this smart technology is developing data about how we live, where we live, what our energy usage is, and using it to develop products for us to buy and taking that data and selling it to other companies. So it's not too scary if the company has a good privacy policy, but what if that company changes hands? What about utility companies that install smart meters? Will pay for smart thermostats for our houses. Will do energy cost reduction programs for us. All of that convenience comes at a cost. Do I really want to sign up with a utility company that's going to give me a free smart thermostat, but at the cost of being able to turn my air conditioning temperature up when their grid starts to get overloaded? Or, God forbid, in a little bit more dystopian world, turn my air conditioning off if they think that I'm not green enough and that I'm using too much energy. And if you don't think that that's coming out there, do a little bit of reading and you'll find out that that is absolutely already a thing out there. So again, the overall point is, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy nut here, is be careful what you buy. Be careful you're okay with the privacy policies of the companies that you're buying from, and know where that data is going and what they're doing with it, because a lot of people are collating it and using it out there. And then the other thing to be aware of, the other security concern out here, what about hacking? How many people actually know how to segment their network and put all of these smart devices on one segment of their network? So if somebody hacks into them, because there's vulnerabilities in these that are being discovered all the time, that they can't compromise your entire network and every computer that's on that network. So this stuff is very, very cool. It's also very, very scary when you start looking into it a little bit deeper. My wife, for example, and I've come to agree with her, we don't have any kind of voice assistant whatsoever turned on in my house because they are listening literally all the time for that voice command for you to activate them. Um, I don't like it. I find it creepy. Obviously, other people feel differently than I do, and they're okay with that technology. All I'm doing is urging you guys to think about it. There are other concerns as well, quite a few of which with smart homes, believe it or not, apply to the real estate business. There really is no return on investment on smart technology. What we're seeing now is sellers who think this is an upgrade, but the reality of it is current technology actually tends to have a very short shelf life. So there really is no real return on investment for almost all of this smart technology that we're talking about. It is cool, admittedly, and absolutely. I can turn my lights on and off from anywhere in the world. I can adjust the temperature in my house from anywhere in the world. We can put a security system in that we can monitor from anywhere, but there's no real return on investment for any of that money that we're putting into our houses. From a real estate standpoint, what about training on all these smart devices? How are you going to do that during the course of a transaction? Are you going to bring your buyers and sellers together before or after that house is sold? If you're going to do that training, remember that when you get buyers and sellers together, they have a tendency to negotiate on stuff when you're not there. It just bears thinking about because this part of our world is changing so rapidly. Also remember that most of this stuff is done by DIY people. I've done all of the stuff in my house, and I'm still a DIY installer. I'm sure I've done some, in fact, I know I've done some of it wrong because I've had to go back and correct all of it. But that means that most of this smart stuff is not being professionally installed, and that can lead to problems with wiring and with the way it's installed as well. Also, it's worth mentioning here, all of this stuff, all of these smart devices and home automation that we've talked about are actually excluded from the home inspection. They are not considered an inspectable part of the house, so we can't go through and test how they integrate together. We can test them locally by, pushing the buttons on those smart light switches in the wall, but that's really all we can do. So we can't tell you whether everything is integrated properly and works right. So technically all the smart home technology is excluded from a home inspection. And then the final thing that bears thinking about, because it happens fairly frequently here, what happens when your power goes out? How much of this stuff do you have to go through your house and reset? And how much of it's not going to play nicely together once it actually is reset? Actually, all the stuff you looked at in my house here is basically on battery backup, so I hopefully don't have to go through and reset all of this stuff after a power outage. There's still lots of things people don't think about when it comes to smart home technology. Real quick, I am going to talk, because I know we're going to get this question, what are some of the brands that I actually like in this space? I like Lutron smart home product. It's called their Cassetta system for in-wall switches, dimmers, fan controls, things like that. I like a company called Ecobee for smart thermostats. They have a good privacy policy. I think their software is better than Nest, which I really don't like because Nest is owned by Google, and to Google, you are just a source of data and information. I tend to like Philips Hue. They're actually now, it's not Philips anymore, but they've kept the brand name. It's a company called Signify for really smart lights. And then I tend to like a company called Sengled for kind of smartish, dumber, more generic lights. I actually have a garage door controller that I really like because I'm that dorky. That's through a company called Tailwind, who actually also has a pretty good privacy policy. And then larger name brand companies like Belkin's Wemo product or TP-Link's Casa product for various generic devices. Right now, I'm using Apple HomeKit where I can and their home app for a hub. That is admittedly a relatively small range of products, although it is getting better. And once that Matter standard comes along, it should get bigger than that. And then right now I'm still using a SmartThings hub to control, to integrate kind of everything, but I am slowly switching over to a Habitat hub because their privacy and their local control is much, much better than a SmartThings hub. But it does require some scripting and some programming, so it's not for everybody. But that's kind of my abbreviated list of stuff that I like for smart home and home automation. All right, real quick questions we've gotten when we put this thing out online. What smart products increase your ROI? Really, none of them, with the possible exceptions of smart thermostats, which can save you some money because they do a better job controlling HVAC systems. So there's some energy savings there. When should you hire a professional to install smart products? The answer to that is basically whenever you're uncomfortable with any of the installation or networking steps. So if you don't know how to pull Cat5 cable for wired, or you're not familiar with internet networking and segmenting stuff off, hire a professional to install it for you. Top 5 smart products worth the investment, whether it's DIY or professional. I really couldn't come up with 5 because none of them are really worth the money that we're spending on them now. But if I had to pick a couple, a good smart thermostat, and then we didn't talk about these, but things like flood sensors to alert you if you have a burst pipe, and basically alarm components like that. Do smart home systems get hacked very often? Smart home systems have vulnerabilities and get hacked all the time. And the cheaper and more generic the equipment, because so much of it is coming from China, the easier it is to get hacked. There's a lot of very generic smart home stuff out there that is actually very easy to hack. This one, we actually now get all the time on inspections. How do we know if you're being videoed when you're showing a house or doing an inspection? The honest answer is you don't. So anytime you are now showing a house, anytime we are now inspecting a house, we are just assuming that we are being videoed the entire time. I think more ethical agents will actually tell you they have cameras in that house and will actually offer to turn them off so that you can conduct an inspection and communicate freely. But in my experience, most people don't ever tell us they have cameras or that they're watching us. Um, and we do find out after the fact that people are watching inspections and watching showings. So just assume anytime now you are on camera. It's becoming that common out there.